August 9th, 1944, mountains of Western Serbia. Captain George Krager pulled himself from the wreckage of his P-38 Lightning fighter, blood running down his face from a gash above his left eye, and realized he had just survived something that should have been impossible. His aircraft had taken anti-aircraft fire during a reconnaissance mission over occupied Yugoslavia, damaging the left engine and forcing him to attempt a landing in mountainous terrain with no suitable airfield within 200 miles. The crash landing in a small valley had destroyed his aircraft, but left him alive, standing in the middle of enemy-occupied territory with no radio, no way to signal for rescue, and no clear path to safety. Within minutes of the crash, figures emerged from the surrounding forest. Captain Krager raised his hands, expecting the worst, but the approaching men were not the occupying forces he feared. They were Yugoslav partisans, resistance fighters who had been operating in these mountains for 3 years, and they had watched his aircraft come down. The leader of the group, a man who introduced himself simply as Nikola, spoke enough broken English to communicate a message that seemed absurd given the circumstances. They would help him escape, not by hiding him and moving him slowly through enemy territory toward Allied lines hundreds of miles away, but by doing something that appeared completely impossible. They would build an airfield right here in this valley and bring in an Allied aircraft to evacuate him. Captain Krager stared at the man, certain he had misunderstood due to language barriers or concussion from the crash. They were standing in a narrow mountain valley barely 300 yards wide, surrounded by steep slopes and dense forest, with enemy patrols operating throughout the region. The idea of constructing an airstrip capable of handling Allied aircraft in such terrain, under enemy observation, without proper equipment or materials, seemed like either a cruel joke or a delusion born of desperation. But Nikola was completely serious. He explained through gestures and limited vocabulary that their group had already helped evacuate several Allied airmen through similar methods. They had connections to Allied command through radio operators in the mountains. They could coordinate a rescue operation. All they needed was 7 days to prepare the valley for an incoming aircraft. The plan that Nikola described to Captain Krager over the next hour as they moved to a hidden camp deeper in the forest revealed an operation of remarkable sophistication, built from desperate necessity and extraordinary determination. The Yugoslav resistance had been conducting these evacuation operations for over a year, developing techniques and organizational structures specifically designed to rescue downed Allied airmen from behind enemy lines. The network included former engineers who had worked on pre-war construction projects, farmers who knew the local terrain intimately, scouts who monitored enemy patrol patterns, and radio operators who maintained contact with Allied forces in Italy. What they proposed was not a rough improvised landing strip, but a functional airfield, constructed in 7 days using only hand tools, local materials, and several hundred volunteers working in secret. The valley where Captain Krager had crashed was actually known to the resistance as a potential evacuation site. They had surveyed it months earlier, identifying it as having the minimum dimensions necessary for a C-47 transport aircraft to land and take off if the terrain was properly prepared. The valley floor was approximately 320 yards long and 80 yards wide at its narrowest point, just barely sufficient for a C-47's landing requirements under perfect conditions. The challenge was that the valley floor in its current state was completely unsuitable for aircraft operations. It was covered with rocks, vegetation, and uneven terrain that would destroy any aircraft attempting to land. Trees bordered both sides of the valley, creating obstacles that would damage wings during approach. Several large boulders sat directly in the path any landing aircraft would need to follow. Streams crossed the valley floor in 2 locations, creating soft ground that would bog down landing gear. Transforming this rough mountain valley into a functional airstrip required moving tons of rock, clearing hundreds of trees, filling and compacting ground using baskets of earth carried from nearby hillsides. The entire operation would need to be conducted during daylight hours when work was visible, but coordinated with scout reports about enemy patrol locations to ensure work stopped whenever patrols approached the area.
The construction operation began at dawn on August 10, 1944, with an organizational meeting that brought together village leaders, resistance coordinators, and work crew supervisors from 6 different mountain communities. The coordination required for this project exceeded anything the resistance network had previously attempted. Each village would contribute workers in rotating shifts to ensure continuous progress without depleting any single community's ability to maintain normal activities that might draw suspicion if disrupted. The work breakdown divided the valley preparation into specific tasks assigned to specialized teams. The clearing team, composed of experienced loggers and forestry workers, would remove trees from the approach paths at both ends of the valley and along the sides where they created wing strike hazards. The trees could not simply be cut and left in place, as the fallen logs would create new obstacles. They needed to be cut, sectioned, and carried away to locations where they would not interfere with aircraft operations. The rock removal team faced the most physically demanding work. Large boulders that could not be moved needed to be broken into manageable pieces using sledgehammers and wedges. Smaller rocks needed to be collected and carried to the valley edges. The team supervisor estimated they would need to move approximately 40 tons of rock to clear the landing path. The ground preparation team would follow behind the clearing and rock removal teams, filling depressions, smoothing uneven terrain, and compacting the soil to create a surface firm enough to support aircraft weight. This work required carrying thousands of baskets of soil and gravel from nearby hillsides and systematically spreading and compacting it across the valley floor. The drainage team would address the streams crossing the valley by creating culverts using logs and stones, channeling water underneath the landing strip rather than allowing it to flow across the surface. The scout coordination team would maintain watch positions on surrounding ridges, monitoring for enemy patrols and signaling when work needed to stop. The resistance had developed a system of visual signals using reflected sunlight during day and covered lanterns at night to communicate patrol movements without using radio transmissions that might be intercepted. Captain Krager watched the first day's work from a concealed observation point and understood that he was witnessing something far beyond simple rescue operation. This was a community mobilizing its collective capability to achieve something that proper military engineering units with powered equipment would find challenging.
By the end of the first day, August 10th, the clearing team had removed 47 trees from the approach paths and valley sides, sectioning them into manageable pieces and carrying them to collection points outside the landing area. The work proceeded with remarkable efficiency, considering the limitations. Each tree required careful assessment to determine the safest direction for felling that would minimize damage to surrounding vegetation and allow easiest processing. Experienced forestry workers directed the cutting, while younger volunteers handled the labor of carrying sectioned logs. The rock removal team had broken up 3 large boulders and moved approximately 8 tons of rock from the landing path. The pace was slower than hoped, but steady. The team supervisor recalculated estimates and determined that with consistent effort they could clear sufficient rock in the available time. The ground preparation team had begun filling major depressions in the valley floor using soil and gravel carried in woven baskets that could hold approximately 40 pounds of material. Each basket required a round trip from the hillside source to the valley floor and back, a distance of roughly 200 yards each direction. The team estimated they would complete several thousand basket trips over the course of the construction period. The drainage work had begun on the first stream crossing, with workers placing logs across the stream bed and covering them with stones and gravel to create a crude but functional culvert. The water would flow beneath the landing strip rather than across it, preventing the soft, muddy ground that would trap aircraft landing gear. By nightfall on August 10th, the village workers returned to their homes, exhausted but maintaining the appearance of normal rural life. The resistance coordinators assessed progress and adjusted schedules for the following day. Scouts reported that enemy patrols had passed within 2 miles of the valley 3 times during the day, but had not approached close enough to observe the construction activity. The second day brought both progress and challenges. The clearing team finished removing trees from the primary approach paths, but identified additional trees along the valley sides that posed wing strike risk and required removal.
The rock removal team maintained steady pace but encountered several boulders larger than initially assessed that would require additional days of work. The ground preparation team expanded their operations as cleared areas became available, but the sheer volume of material that needed to be moved was becoming apparent. Meanwhile, Captain Krager remained in the concealed observation position, watching the work and struggling with the knowledge that hundreds of people were risking their safety for his rescue. The resistance had explained that discovery of this operation by occupying forces would result in severe reprisals against the participating villages.
The midpoint of the construction period, August 13th, brought both encouraging progress and sobering realization about the project's scale. The valley was visibly transformed from its natural state, but significant work remained. The clearing team had removed all identified trees that posed direct hazards to aircraft operations. More than 180 trees had been cut, sectioned, and removed from the landing area and approach paths. The visual transformation was dramatic. What had been a forested valley floor now showed clear sight lines from end to end. The rock removal team had cleared approximately 60% of the identified obstacles. The remaining work focused on several particularly large boulders that required days of sledgehammer work to break into movable pieces. The physical toll on workers was visible. Hands were blistered and backs ached from the continuous manual labor. The ground preparation team had made substantial progress in smoothing the valley floor, but the task of achieving uniformly firm, level ground across the entire landing strip remained incomplete. They had moved an estimated 120 tons of soil and gravel in tens of thousands of individual basket trips, yet areas of soft ground remained that needed additional filling and compacting. The drainage team had completed both stream crossings, creating functional culverts that channeled water beneath the landing strip. Testing with diverted stream flow confirmed the structures would handle water volume without creating surface flooding or undermining. The coordination between teams had developed into an efficient rhythm. As clearing teams opened new areas, rock removal teams moved in immediately, followed by ground preparation teams who filled and smoothed. The sequential workflow minimized delays and maintained steady progress. Scout teams had reported increasing enemy patrol activity in the region during the past 2 days. Patrols had approached within 1 mile of the valley on 2 occasions, requiring work stoppages until scouts confirmed the patrols had moved away. These interruptions reduced productive work hours, but were essential for maintaining operational security. The resistance coordinators assessed that they remained on schedule for completion within the 7-day target, despite these interruptions. Captain Krager had spent 5 days watching this extraordinary effort and struggling with complicated emotions. Gratitude for the villagers' willingness to help him. Guilt about the danger they faced on his behalf. Amazement at what they were accomplishing with such limited resources. Anxiety about whether the final result would actually be sufficient for aircraft operations. On August 14th, the 6th day of construction, the project entered its final phase. The major clearing and rock removal were complete. The focus shifted to final ground preparation, surface smoothing, and verification that the airstrip met minimum standards for safe aircraft operations.
The final 48 hours of construction work transformed the valley from rough cleared ground to something that resembled, at least minimally, a functional airstrip. The ground preparation teams conducted detailed surface smoothing, addressing every depression, bump, or irregularity that might damage aircraft landing gear or cause problems during takeoff roll. Workers walked the entire length of the strip repeatedly, identifying problem areas and immediately addressing them with additional filling or smoothing. The compaction process involved not just spreading soil, but systematically walking over filled areas in organized patterns, using human foot traffic to compress the ground. Hundreds of villagers walked back and forth across the landing strip in coordinated lines, their combined weight gradually compacting the loose soil into firmer surface. The process was time-consuming but effective. The final surface preparation included spreading a thin layer of gravel across areas of particular concern where soft ground might remain. The gravel, carried in the same woven baskets used throughout the project, provided additional surface stability and drainage. By the evening of August 15th, the valley had been transformed into something that, while crude by military airfield standards, met the minimum requirements for C-47 operations under emergency conditions. The strip measured approximately 320 yards in usable length, with cleared approach paths at both ends providing reasonable clearance for aircraft descent and climb. The surface was relatively smooth and firm across the critical center section where aircraft weight would be concentrated during landing and takeoff. The resistance coordinators conducted a final inspection on the morning of August 16th, walking the entire strip and assessing whether it met the standards they had communicated to Allied command. Their assessment concluded that the strip was functional but marginal. A skilled pilot flying a well-maintained C-47 under good weather conditions could successfully land, take on passengers, and take off. The margin for error was minimal, and the operation would need to proceed only under optimal conditions. The radio message sent to Allied command in Italy that afternoon confirmed the strip was ready and requested immediate evacuation operation. The message included critical details about the strip's dimensions, surface conditions, approach paths, and recommended landing direction based on prevailing winds. Allied command responded within hours, confirming that a C-47 would be dispatched the following morning, August 17th, with arrival estimated at mid-morning depending on weather and operational conditions. The aircraft would carry supplies for the resistance as cargo on the inbound flight and would evacuate Captain Krager and any other Allied personnel in the area on the return flight. That evening, the village workers gathered at the valley one final time, not to work, but to celebrate what they had accomplished. 7 days of sustained manual labor had transformed a mountain valley into an emergency airstrip. They had moved tons of rock, cleared hundreds of trees, transported thousands of baskets of soil, and created something that should have required weeks of engineering units with powered equipment.
August 17, 1944, dawned clear and calm, providing the optimal weather conditions necessary for the evacuation operation. The resistance scouts had confirmed no enemy patrol activity in the immediate area during the overnight hours. The valley was quiet, except for the sounds of wind through the surrounding forest and water flowing through the culverts beneath the landing strip. Captain Krager stood at the edge of the airstrip at 900 hours, watching the eastern sky and listening for aircraft engines. The resistance coordinators had positioned lookouts on surrounding ridges with instructions to signal immediately if they spotted the incoming C-47 or detected any enemy response to its approach. The coordination plan called for the C-47 to approach the valley at low altitude from the east, following a river valley that provided terrain masking from enemy observation posts. The aircraft would have only minutes over the valley to assess the landing strip, make its approach, land, offload cargo, board passengers, and take off before noise attracted enemy attention. At 0947 hours, the lookouts signaled aircraft approaching from the east. Within minutes, the distinctive silhouette of a C-47 transport appeared above the ridgeline, flying at approximately 500 feet altitude. The pilot made a single pass over the valley, assessing the landing strip from above, then banked sharply and set up for final approach. The C-47 descended toward the valley, reducing speed and extending flaps, committed to a landing that offered no possibility for wave-off if conditions proved unsuitable. The aircraft touched down approximately 40 yards from the western end of the strip, well within the available landing distance. The landing was firm but controlled, the aircraft rolling along the prepared surface that held under the weight without collapsing or creating problems. The pilot brought the C-47 to a stop roughly 2/3 down the strip, immediately reversing direction to position for takeoff back toward the west. The entire landing sequence had taken less than 2 minutes. Before the propellers had stopped rotating, villagers were unloading cargo from the aircraft. The C-47 had carried supplies specifically requested by the resistance: medical supplies, ammunition, radio equipment, and food items that were unavailable in the mountains. The unloading proceeded with remarkable speed, with supplies handed down from the cargo door to waiting villagers who immediately carried them away from the aircraft.
Simultaneously, Captain Krager and two other Allied airmen who had been hiding in the area approached the aircraft for boarding. The total time on the ground was 7 minutes. The pilot kept engines running throughout, ready for immediate departure. As the last supply crate was unloaded and the passengers were secured inside the aircraft, the pilot increased power and began the takeoff roll back toward the west. The C-47 accelerated along the valley floor, the prepared surface holding firm, and lifted off with approximately 60 yards of strip remaining. The aircraft climbed steeply, banking to follow the river valley back toward Allied territory.
The successful evacuation operation on August 17, 1944, represented the culmination of the most ambitious civilian-assisted rescue operation conducted in the Yugoslav theater during the entire war. What made this achievement remarkable was not merely the technical accomplishment of building a functional airstrip in 7 days using only manual labor, but the organizational sophistication and community commitment required to coordinate hundreds of volunteers working in secret under constant threat of discovery. The statistical scope of what the villagers had accomplished became clearer through post-war analysis. Over the 7-day construction period, approximately 300 individual workers had contributed labor in rotating shifts. The total person-hours invested in the project exceeded 8,000 hours of manual work. They had cleared 180 trees from the landing area and approach paths, moved an estimated 65 tons of rock, transported more than 150 tons of soil and gravel in individual basket loads, constructed 2 functional culverts to manage stream crossings, and created a landing surface measuring 320 yards by 80 yards that could support a 26,000-pound aircraft. The tools used throughout the project consisted entirely of hand implements: axes, saws, sledgehammers, wedges, shovels, picks, and woven baskets. No powered equipment of any kind had been employed, both because such equipment was unavailable to the resistance and because the noise would have attracted unwanted attention. The security maintained throughout the operation was equally impressive. Despite 7 days of continuous activity involving hundreds of people, the occupying forces never detected the construction project. The scout network that monitored enemy patrols and signaled when work needed to stop had functioned flawlessly. The coordination between 6 different villages had maintained operational security, with participants understanding that discussing the project outside authorized channels would endanger everyone involved. Captain Krager's evacuation was not the first or last Allied airmen rescued through this method. The Yugoslav resistance conducted similar operations throughout 1944 and into 1945, constructing temporary airstrips, coordinating aircraft landings, and evacuating downed airmen who would otherwise have faced capture or death in the mountains. Historical records indicate that approximately 400 Allied airmen were evacuated from Yugoslavia through resistance-coordinated operations during the war, though not all evacuations involved airstrip construction. The methodology developed by the Yugoslav resistance influenced Allied escape and evasion procedures throughout the Mediterranean theater. The techniques for rapid airstrip construction using local labor and materials, the coordination protocols for aircraft landings in hostile territory, and the security procedures for protecting operations from enemy detection all became documented practices that informed subsequent rescue operations. The relationship between Allied forces and Yugoslav resistance that enabled these operations represented a complex partnership built on shared objectives despite significant political differences. The resistance included multiple factions with competing visions for post-war Yugoslavia, but they cooperated effectively in operations supporting Allied military objectives.
The post-war recognition of what the Yugoslav villagers had accomplished came slowly and incompletely, constrained by the political complexities of the Cold War period and the challenge of documenting operations that had been conducted in secret. Captain Krager returned to the United States after his evacuation and completed his military service, eventually returning to civilian life in California. He maintained correspondence with the Yugoslav resistance contacts who had coordinated his rescue, though communication became increasingly difficult as political barriers between East and West solidified in the late 1940s. In the decades following the war, The story of the improvised airstrips built by Yugoslav villagers remained largely unknown outside military aviation history circles. The operations had been conducted under wartime secrecy, documented minimally, and complicated by post-war political divisions that made collaboration between former Allied nations and Yugoslav authorities difficult. The physical evidence of these operations disappeared quickly after the war. The temporary airstrips constructed for evacuation operations were not maintained. Within months of their use, vegetation reclaimed the cleared valleys, trees grew back in the approach paths, and the improvised surfaces deteriorated. By the 1950s, no visible trace remained of what had been accomplished in August 1944. The human memory of these events persisted longer, but faced its own challenges. Many of the villagers who had participated in construction work did not discuss their wartime activities publicly, partly due to the political sensitivity of acknowledging cooperation with Western Allied forces in the new Yugoslav state, and partly because rural communities generally did not celebrate or publicize their wartime experiences. The recognition that eventually came began in the 1970s, when historians researching Allied air operations in the Mediterranean began documenting the escape and evasion networks that had operated in Yugoslavia. Interviews with surviving airmen who had been evacuated through these operations revealed the sophisticated rescue network that had functioned in the mountains. Captain Krager's testimony provided detailed information about the August 1944 airstrip construction operation. He described watching hundreds of villagers transform a rough mountain valley into a functional landing strip in 7 days, using only hand tools and determination. His account emphasized not just the technical achievement, but the human commitment represented by ordinary people accepting extraordinary risk to help a stranger. Subsequent research identified some of the key figures in the resistance network that had coordinated the operation, though many participants were never individually identified in historical records. The village communities that had contributed labor were acknowledged collectively rather than through individual recognition. The story serves as documentation of what civilian populations can accomplish under extreme circumstances when organized around clear objectives and willing to accept significant personal risk. The technical achievement of constructing a functional airstrip using only manual labor demonstrates capabilities that modern engineering practice might dismiss as impractical or impossible. The organizational sophistication required to coordinate hundreds of volunteers working in secret reveals social structures and community capabilities that existed in rural Yugoslavia during the war period.
The lasting significance of the Yugoslav airstrip operations extends beyond the specific rescues they facilitated to illuminate broader truths about human capability, community solidarity, and moral choice in wartime. The villagers who spent 7 days in August 1944 moving rocks, clearing trees, and carrying baskets of soil were not acting from abstract ideological commitment to Allied victory. Most had limited understanding of the broader strategic situation or political complexities of the war. They were responding to an immediate human need, a downed pilot who needed help to survive with the capabilities they possessed. The decision to help represented both practical assessment and moral conviction. The practical element recognized that helping Allied airmen supported resistance against the occupying forces that had disrupted their lives and threatened their communities. Each successful evacuation represented a small victory against the occupation and demonstrated that resistance networks could operate effectively despite enemy presence. The moral element recognized human obligation that transcended political boundaries or military affiliations. The villagers saw a young man, far from home, in desperate circumstances through no fault of his own, and chose to help because helping was the right thing to do. This combination of practical and moral motivation created commitment that sustained the project through 7 days of exhausting manual labor conducted under constant risk. The engineering achievement represented the application of traditional rural knowledge and skills to an unusual problem.
The villagers were not trained aircraft ground crews or military engineers, but they possessed deep understanding of their local terrain, experience with construction and earth moving from agricultural work, and practical problem-solving abilities developed through lives spent working with limited resources. The project succeeded because they adapted their existing knowledge to new purposes, approaching the challenge systematically and learning from experience as work progressed. The organizational structure that coordinated the operation reflected community social networks and resistance organizational experience. Village leaders who normally coordinated agricultural activities adapted their skills to construction management. Resistance members who coordinated military operations applied their security procedures to protecting civilian workers. The combination created an effective hybrid organization that could mobilize large-scale effort while maintaining operational security. Captain George Kracher returned to the valley in 1974, 30 years after his rescue, traveling as a private citizen to Yugoslavia to meet with survivors of the resistance network that had saved his life. The reunion brought together elderly men and women who had been young adults in 1944, carrying rocks and baskets of soil to build an airstrip for a stranger. Their conversations, conducted through translators and recorded by a local journalist, captured the enduring bonds created by shared experience. The participants expressed different memories and perspectives about the operation, but they shared common recognition that they had accomplished something remarkable. They had built an airstrip in 7 days using only hand tools and collective determination. They had enabled a rescue operation that returned a young pilot to his family. They had demonstrated that ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances could achieve extraordinary things. The valley where the airstrip was constructed remains a quiet mountain landscape, showing no visible evidence of what happened there in August 1944. Trees have grown back in the approach paths. The streams flow naturally across the valley floor where culverts once channeled them. The only physical reminder is a small memorial plaque placed in 1985 by local veterans organizations, marking the location where villagers once built hope from determination and rocks from the hillsides. This story, like many stories from that war, remained buried, not through deliberate suppression, but through the simple passage of time and the tendency of rural communities to focus on present challenges rather than past achievements. It represents countless similar stories of ordinary people making extraordinary choices, acting with courage that went unrecognized officially but mattered profoundly to those whose lives were saved through their actions.